The day my brother walked into my father's study and announced he needed $50,000, my parents didn't even blink. I was standing in the hallway just outside the door, still holding my car keys. I had driven 3 hours from Raleigh because my mother called crying. Said my father's blood pressure was bad again. Said she needed help around the house. I'd taken 2 days off work. I'd stopped at a grocery store outside of Greensboro and bought soup ingredients, the kind my father liked, because that's what I did. That's what I'd always done. And I stood there in that hallway listening to my brother ask for $50,000, and my father said, "Of course, son, we'll figure it out." No questions. No what for, just of course. I put my keys in my pocket and walked into the kitchen and started unpacking the groceries. My name is Tessa. Was the older daughter, the responsible one, the one who got a full scholarship to NC State, graduated with honors, passed the CPA exam on her first attempt, and spent the next 7 years building a career in forensic accounting at a firm in Raleigh that specialized in financial fraud investigation. The one who sent money home every month for 2 years when my father's hardware store was struggling, who flew back for every holiday, who remembered my parents' anniversary when my brother forgot it 4 years in a row. My brother's name is Scott. He was 29 when all of this happened. He had a gym membership he didn't use, a truck my parents co-signed for, and a business idea every 3 months that never became anything. He was also the one my parents introduced first at every family gathering, the one my mother lit up for, the one my father called son in that particular tone, warm, proud, like the word meant something different coming out of his mouth than it did for everyone else. I used to think I had made peace with it. I used to tell myself it didn't matter who the favorite was because I had built something real. I had a career, a reputation, a life I was proud of. I told myself that enough times that I almost believed it. Then Scott decided he needed $50,000 and the house my grandfather had left to me. Let me back up. My grandfather, my mother's father, died when I was 26. He left a small property in his will, a house in Asheville he'd owned free and clear for 30 years. Nothing fancy. 3 bedrooms, a covered porch, a view of the mountains that made you understand why people never wanted to leave that part of North Carolina. He left it to me, specifically. Not to my mother. Not split between the grandchildren. To me by name, because he said I reminded him of himself, someone who worked for what she had and didn't ask anyone for anything. I'd been renting it out for 6 years. Modest income, nothing life-changing, but steady. And I'd kept it maintained, kept the taxes paid, kept everything exactly the way my grandfather would have wanted. Scott had been telling my parents for years that the property was wasted on me, that I didn't even live there, that he could turn it into something real, an Airbnb operation, he said. Or maybe a wedding venue, he wasn't sure yet, but something. My parents listened to him the way they always listened to him, with complete, uncritical belief. What I didn't know, what I didn't find out until much later, was that Scott had already borrowed money from people he shouldn't have borrowed from. Not a bank, not a credit union. People who charged interest in ways that didn't appear on any paperwork and who had a specific way of communicating their expectations. He needed the property, he needed it fast, and he needed a way to get it without coming to me directly, because he knew I would say no. So my family found another way. It started with the accusation. My father called me on a Tuesday morning in March. I was at my desk reviewing a set of corporate financial statements when my phone rang, and I saw his name, and I answered it the way I always did, immediately, because my parents had trained me from childhood to believe that their calls were urgent by nature. He didn't say hello. He said, "Tessa, we need to talk about your grandfather's accounts." I asked him what he meant. He said that my mother had been looking through some of my grandfather's old paperwork. She was doing a state organization, he said, some old boxes she'd found, and she had come across some discrepancies, that it looked like money had been moved from my grandfather's investment account in the 2 years before he died. That the amounts lined up with deposits into an account I had opened the same year. I went completely still. I said, "Dad, that's not true." He said he wasn't accusing me of anything. He said he just wanted me to explain it. He said Scott had looked at it too and was very concerned, and that they didn't want this to become something legal, if it could be handled privately. That phrase, if it could be handled privately. I didn't understand what I was hearing. I sat at my desk in my office in Raleigh with a view of the parking garage and tried to process the idea that my family was suggesting I had stolen from my grandfather, the man who had trusted me, the man who left me his house. I said I would come home that weekend. I said I would bring my own documentation. I said there was nothing to explain because nothing had happened, but I would prove that. My father said that was fine. He said to come Saturday. He said my mother was very upset. Of course she was. I drove to Burlington. My parents still lived in the house I grew up in, a brick ranch on a quiet street near the county fairgrounds. And I brought 2 years of my personal financial records. Bank statements, tax returns, documentation of every transfer I had made during the period they mentioned. I had spent Thursday and Friday pulling everything together, going through it with the kind of methodical care I applied to every fraud case I worked professionally. I knew what the records would show because I knew what I had done, which was nothing. I was prepared for a conversation. I was not prepared for what was actually waiting for me. When I pulled into the driveway Saturday morning, there were 2 cars I didn't recognize, parked on the street. I went inside and found my parents sitting in the living room with Scott. And next to Scott was a man named, he introduced himself as, a family attorney. And next to the attorney was a woman who introduced herself as a friend of the family, though I had never seen her before and she had a notepad in her hand. I stood in the doorway with my folder of documentation and understood, in a way that felt physical, like something dropping in my chest, that this had never been about a conversation. My father said, "Tessa, sit down." I sat. The attorney explained that my family had engaged him to look into a potential civil matter involving my grandfather's estate. He said they had documentation suggesting I had exerted undue influence over my grandfather in his final years, that I had cultivated a relationship with him specifically to position myself to inherit the Asheville property over other family members. He said the investment account discrepancies further suggested possible misappropriation. He used the word misappropriation. I looked at my mother. She was looking at her hands. I looked at Scott. He was looking at me with an expression I can only describe as careful. Not angry. Not sad. Careful. Like he was watching to see how I would respond. I said, "I would like to know what documentation you have." They showed me 3 pages. The pages showed account activity I had never seen before. Account numbers that were similar to mine but not mine, off by 1 digit. My name typed in a field next to them. Someone had manufactured paperwork. Not well enough to survive professional scrutiny, but well enough for a family meeting in Burlington on a Saturday morning. I said very quietly, "This isn't real." The attorney said the family was prepared to resolve the matter, without involving law enforcement, if I was willing to sign over the Asheville property voluntarily and allow Scott to manage the estate assets going forward. He said they wanted to keep this in the family. I looked at my father. I said, "Did you know this was fabricated?" My father looked at the window and said he just wanted things to be fair. I picked up my folder. I stood up. I said I needed to make a phone call. My brother said, "Tessa, don't make this hard." I walked outside. Here's what my family did not know about me. They knew I was a CPA. They knew I worked in accounting. They had never asked exactly what kind of accounting, because in my family, the details of my professional life had never been particularly interesting to anyone. When I said forensic accounting, my mother nodded and changed the subject. When I mentioned fraud investigation, my father said that sounded stressful. What they did not know was that for the past 3 years, I had been working on a contract basis with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, not as an employee, as a contracted specialist. The kind of work that doesn't show up on a resume in any detail. The kind of work where you sign confidentiality agreements and learn to be careful about what you say at family dinners. What they also did not know was that 8 months before that Saturday in Burlington, a case had landed on my desk that I recognized. Not because I knew the subject personally, because I recognized a pattern. Shell companies registered in Delaware with no real operations. Transfers routed through LLCs with no employees. Income reported in amounts just under the thresholds that trigger automatic review. The case was connected to a regional contractor operation, residential construction mostly, that had been moving money in ways that didn't add up. The money was coming from somewhere and going somewhere, and the somewhere was not being disclosed to the IRS. My brother was a general contractor. He had been one for 2 years, his latest venture. He worked for a company based in Winston-Salem. I had flagged a connection 8 months ago and disclosed it to my supervisor and recused myself from that specific thread of the investigation. I had done everything correctly. I had been waiting to see where it went. It had gone very far. I sat in my car in my parents' driveway and called my contact at the CI division. I told him what had just happened inside that house. I told him about the fabricated documents, the attorney, the coercion. I told him I believed the property transfer being demanded of me might be connected to an attempt to acquire an asset that could be used in their financial structure. A property in Asheville with no mortgage, owned free and clear. Ideal for running transactions through a short-term rental operation without scrutiny. He listened. He said he would make some calls. I said I would like to go back inside and buy some time. He said, "Don't sign anything." I said I had no intention of signing anything. I went back inside and I told my family I needed 2 weeks to speak with my own attorney before I could make any decisions. I said I understood their concerns. I said I wanted to resolve this without it becoming adversarial. I used the word collaborative and watched my brother relax slightly and my mother nod like she was relieved. My father asked if I was going to be difficult about this. I said no. I drove back to Raleigh and spent the next 11 days doing the most precise, careful work of my professional life. I was not part of the official investigation. I had been recused. But I was allowed to provide documentation relevant to the coercion attempt, which was a separate matter, and I worked with investigators who were following threads I had helped identify months earlier. I also hired a private attorney in Asheville who specialized in estate law and had her begin pulling every public record connected to my grandfather's estate, my brother's business filings, and the LLC registrations that had come up in my earlier analysis. What we found was not subtle once you knew where to look. Scott's construction company was a pass-through. The real money movement was happening through 2 LLCs registered under a name I didn't recognize, but which shared an address with an entity that had been flagged in an unrelated investigation 2 years prior. The $50,000 my parents had given Scott, I found out later it was $60,000. Not 50, had moved through 3 accounts in 11 days and arrived at a place that had nothing to do with any home improvement project. And the fabricated documents they had shown me at that Saturday meeting? The account numbers that were close to mine but not mine? The woman with the notepad had taken photographs of my real financial documents during a visit to my parents' home 6 weeks earlier, when I had mailed them a copy of my tax return for an insurance matter. Someone had used that information to construct paperwork designed to look like evidence. That was not a family dispute, that was fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, coercion, potentially wire fraud depending on how the communications had occurred. My attorney filed a criminal complaint with the State Attorney General's office on a Wednesday. By Thursday, the IRSCI case had expanded. By the following Monday, the day I was supposed to return to Burlington to give my family an answer, 3 federal investigators made contact with Scott's business partner. I drove to Burlington anyway. I want to be honest about what that drive felt like. I have described this to people since, and they expect me to say I felt powerful. Vindicated. Ready. I felt sick the entire way. These were my parents. The man who taught me to ride a bike in the Kmart parking lot on Maple Avenue, because he was worried I'd fall in the street. The woman who sat outside my door all night when I had the flu at 14. Because she was afraid I'd stop breathing in my sleep. Whatever had happened, whatever they had allowed to happen, whatever they had convinced themselves was justified, they were my parents. I thought about that the whole drive up I-40. And then I thought about my grandfather, who smelled like cedar and worked with his hands and told me once, when I was 9 years old and had been cheated out of first place in a school competition by a kid whose parents knew the judges, Tessa, the only thing that's actually yours is what you build yourself. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. I thought about the house on the mountain that he left to me, because he trusted me. I pulled into the driveway. My parents and Scott were inside. The attorney was there again. The woman with the notepad was not. My father said, "Have you made a decision?" I said I had. I put a folder on the coffee table. It was not my personal financial records this time. It was a document my attorney had prepared, a formal summary of the criminal complaint filed with the AG's office, the documented evidence of fabricated materials, and a letter outlining what the next steps would be if we did not receive written confirmation within 48 hours that the family had withdrawn all claims against my grandfather's estate and against me personally. I said, "I need you to read that." Scott reached for it first. He opened it. I watched his face. I have thought about his expression many times since. It moved through about four things very quickly: confusion, recognition, anger, and then it stopped at something that looked almost like he had just understood something for the first time, like he had believed, genuinely believed, that I wouldn't push back, that I would do what I had always done: absorb it, accommodate it, find a way to keep the peace. My mother said, "Tessa, what is this?" I said, "It's what happens when you try to steal from someone who investigates financial fraud for a living." My father said my name, just my name, the way he used to say it when I was small, and he was proud of me for something, which made it worse, somehow, that he said it like that now. I said, "I'm not signing anything. I'm not transferring the property. And I need all of you to understand that what you participated in, whether you understood the full scope of it or not, has consequences." The attorney started to say something about the civil matter still being a separate issue. My attorney, who had been waiting in the hallway, yes, I had brought her, I had learned something about walking into rooms unprepared, came in at that moment and handed the family attorney her card and said she was happy to discuss the matter, but that her client was not signing any documents today or any other day, and that any further contact regarding the Asheville property should go through her office only. Scott stood up. He said, "You think this makes you better than us?" I said, "No, I think this makes me done." I picked up my folder. I looked at my mother, who was crying in the way she cried when she was genuinely upset, rather than performing upset, quietly, without looking at anyone, and I felt the grief of it, the whole accumulated weight of a lifetime of being the one who held on, harder than anyone held on to her. I felt it completely, and I walked out. The criminal investigation took 14 months. I was not the lead, not even close. I was a witness, a document provider, a person who answered questions when asked and otherwise stayed out of it. The investigators were thorough. They were careful. The evidence was significant. Scott's business partner took a plea deal. Scott was indicted on 3 counts, including conspiracy to commit wire fraud. He accepted a plea agreement in the spring, 2 years after that Saturday meeting in Burlington. He did not go to prison. His attorney negotiated intensively and he received a substantial fine, 5 years of probation, and 200 hours of community service. His contractor's license was suspended for 3 years. The people he had borrowed money from, the ones with the informal interest rates, had a separate reckoning that I was not part of and don't know the details of. The fabricated documents were traced back to Scott and his business partner. My mother was interviewed 3 times by investigators. She was not charged. She had not known the full structure of what was happening. She had believed a version of events that Scott had carefully constructed for her. Whether that excuses her participation in the Saturday meeting in allowing the attorney to be present, in agreeing to try to pressure me into signing away what my grandfather left me. That is a question I have sat with for a long time and have not entirely resolved. My father called me 6 months after everything concluded. He said he was sorry. He said he had told himself he was protecting the family, and he had been wrong about what protection meant. I said I appreciated him calling. I haven't been back to that house in Burlington since. The property in Asheville is still mine. I repainted the porch last summer, a deep green that my grandfather would have either loved or had strong opinions about, probably both. My tenants are a young couple, teachers, who grow tomatoes in the backyard garden and send me a photo of the mountains every October when the leaves turn. When I look at that photo, I think about what it costs to keep that place. I think about the version of me who stood in my parents' hallway holding soup ingredients, who had driven 3 hours because someone called and said they needed her, who had spent her whole life trying to be worth the same room as her brother. I think about how long I told myself the work was enough, that being competent and reliable and present was its own answer to the question of whether I belonged. It wasn't. It was never enough for them. And the hardest thing I've ever learned, harder than the CPA exam, harder than anything that happened in 14 months of federal investigation, is that some people's approval was never available to me at any price. My grandfather knew that. He left me a house on a mountain to make sure I would know it too. I'm starting to. I keep coming back to the folder I carried into my parents' house that Saturday morning. The one with 2 years of clean financial records, organized the way I organize everything, methodically, completely, without gaps. I was so prepared to prove my innocence that I walked straight into a room that had never been about evidence. That's the thing nobody tells you about being the responsible one in a family that doesn't value responsibility. Your competence doesn't protect you. It just makes you a more convenient target. What happened to me and to Scott was not random. It followed a logic that had been building for years, one small choice at a time. My brother had learned, across 3 decades of being handed things without consequence, that problems could always be solved by finding someone else to absorb the cost. My parents had taught him that without meaning to, one co-signed truck and one unanswered question at a time. And I had learned across those same 3 decades to show up and handle things and ask for nothing. We had all been shaped by the same household into the people we became on that Saturday in Burlington. Cause builds consequence. It always does, even when it takes years to arrive. What I've thought about more than the investigation, more than the indictment, is the kind of person I had to be to get through it. Not the credentials, not the IRS contract or the forensic training. The character underneath all of that. There was a moment sitting in my car in that driveway after the attorney finished speaking, when I could have done any number of things. I could have signed the papers to keep the peace, the way I kept it my entire life. I could have screamed. I could have screamed. I could have fallen apart. What I did instead was make a phone call, tell the truth about what had just happened, and ask for help in a way that was useful rather than reactive. That required something I didn't have a word for at the time, a kind of moral steadiness, a refusal to compromise what was real even when the people who were supposed to love me were asking me to. You can't fake that in a moment of pressure. Either you've built it or you haven't. I had built it slowly, over years, in the unglamorous work of doing the right thing, when no one was watching and nothing depended on it. That's the only way it gets built. And then there was the work itself. 11 days of pulling records, tracking transfers, identifying patterns and structures that had been deliberately designed to be invisible. That required me to think clearly when I had every emotional reason not to. It required me to separate what I felt from what I could prove. I had spent 7 years training that particular muscle, without knowing I would need it for this. My grandfather's house, my own name, my own integrity, those were what was at stake. And I could not afford to be anything other than precise. I think about my grandfather a lot. He didn't leave me that property because I was the prettiest, or the most charming, or the one who made holidays easier. He left it to me because he recognized something, a willingness to do the hard thing without looking for applause. He saw it before I fully understood it myself. Scott is still my brother. My parents are still my parents. I don't carry hatred about any of it. What I carry is clarity about what I'm willing to accept, about what belongs to me, about who showed up for me when it mattered and who didn't. The house is still in the mountain. The porch is green. And I am, for the first time in my life, completely, quietly sure of myself. That's worth more than anyone's approval.